Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. All right, cool. So I have another one of the games from the Opera Euro. As you guys know, of course, Wesley So did win that. I thought it was a pretty interesting game, and I believe it's from round 3, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, it was round 8, game number 3 that they played. But it's a real roller coaster game. Some of you guys have maybe seen it. I'm trying to see if I can put my own little spin on it. So yeah, I appreciate everybody coming by. So I'm gonna say Kamusta, Aking Magat Kabagan, say Messiah Akong, Makita Kang Muli. Yeah, so I'm getting a little faster. It's still, it's a big chunk. So I'm getting a lot of, it's gonna take me a little minute to get there. But appreciate you guys coming by. Salamat for anybody who is from Norway. Got Morgan and Tack for coming by and looking at my video. Hello to you. Appreciate it very much, guys. And if you guys are ready, let's see if we can't jump in and see what we have for this game. So we have e4, we got e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5. So we have the Italian game, or the Giuoco piano. Is what it's called here. So we have castles by white, we have knight to f6, and we have d3. So we have the Giuoco Pianissimo. As you guys that are familiar with the terms, Giuoco piano is quiet game in Italian, and Giuoco Pianissimo is very quiet game. So that's what d3 does. Sometimes you'll see c3 and d4. Sometimes you'll see c3, d3. A4 is going to be coming, trying to see if you can trap a root of bishop real quick. So we see d6. By black, we got c3 by white, a5, trying to make sure that there's no expansion over here on the queen side, which is something that white is going to try to do. So we see rook to e1, we have castles by black, knight b to d2, we have bishop back to a7. You're wanting to maintain the bishop on this diagonal because there can be some attacking possibilities at some point. A lot of times you'll see knight to f1 and you'll see bishop to e3 looking to trade this bishop off because this bishop is very, very strong. And you don't want any like knight g4 situations coming. So, like as I said, knight to f1. We have bishop to e6. We got bishop to b5. Let me just adjust the screen here. We got bishop to e7. We have d4. We got c6, knocking the bishop. We got bishop back to d3. And we are still in theory, believe it or not. The Giuoco piano, Giuoco pianissimo. These openings have been played for, 400 or 500 years at least. And that's just what we know as far as recorded history goes. Because a lot of these openings are probably played well before this period. But, until you had Damiano or Lucina or Philidor or Ruy Lopez de Segura writing books, we didn't really have a record of these games being played and stuff like that. So anyway, we do see knight to g6. We have h3, knight to h5, and then we have the novelty of the game, which is bishop to e3. The thing that's kind of tricky sometimes about finding the novelty is when I got to this position here, the database showed no games. And then once I did this and got here, it showed some games. So it kind of like fluctuates back and forth. So, a lot of the times, you have to, when you feel like you've got the novelty, you have to go a couple moves past. Just to make sure that you truly got the novelty. So if I'm not fully mistaken, bishop to e3 is the novelty of the game. And after another couple of moves, I didn't see anything come up in the database after that. So we do see knight h to f4. And we have bishop back to c2. So we have queen to c8. And this is something to preface what's going to be going on coming up. You always need to make sure that you're wary when you have a bishop and a queen lined up against a pawn that is advanced to h3 or h6. The same thing with white as if they move the queen over to c1 and you have h6 played and you have the bishop, and the queen kind of eyeing that thing. Sacrifices are generally on the menu, especially when you have a knight here, because this whole thing, as you can see, there is a lot of pressure on all of these points here. So that's something I want you guys to make sure you're paying attention to in your games. A lot of times you'll see like a king to h2 move, which in this particular situation, it wouldn't really help because you have 3 pieces attacking. But generally, you don't have this knight, just kind of like, entrenched in your position here. But that's something that's going to be relevant here in a second. So we have bishop to b3. We got pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and then we have queen takes d4. And this is actually a horrible blunder by Wesley. So, you know, like as I showed you guys before, I kind of prefaced it. You know, these points are very, very weak for white, and so I'm not sure if Magnus Carlsen, you know, what exactly his plan was, but before I show you what was played in the game, if you want to go ahead and take a minute to pause the video and see the explosive move that Magnus Carlsen has at his disposal, it should kind of be automatic for somebody that's on, you know, the world champion level like Carlsen is. So, like I said, if you want to go ahead and pause it real quick and see what the killer move is, go ahead and do that right now. Okay, cool. So, I'm going to show you what he actually played in the game. He just completely missed the sacrifices on this queen side. So he took bishop took b3, and I'm not really sure if he had calculated. I mean, of course, this is something that's going to come up in Magnus Carlsen's mind. You know, this sacrifice over here. But so it's like I'm not sure if he calculated it, and in his mind it just didn't really fully work, and he didn't want to go into it or what. But like I said, he did take bishop takes b3. Now the move is knight takes g2. And you have a couple of problems. You can either accept it or, you know, not accept it. Either way, you're pretty much going to end up with the same position, just with different pieces. So if we do accept it, the king would take it on g2. Of course, you'd have the bishop taken on h3 with check. The king would come to h2, and then you'd have knight to h4. And knight h4 is really, really, really a problem because of this fork here. Once it lands on f3, you're forking. It's just called a family fork. Because everybody in the family gets involved. The queen, the king, and the rook. So that's the biggest fork you can pretty much do. You know, with the exception of the rook being like maybe on this square or something like that, and just being a four-way fork. And so, you know, you're gonna really pretty much have to move the queen somewhere. You know, to take on d6. The knight would come to f3 anyway. You'd come down to h1, and then after the bishop takes on f1, you actually cannot take back. The problem is if you take back with the rook, you're going to be running into checkmate, and that's all she's going to be writing for that. So you have to move the queen back to protect this square. And after the knight takes on e1, the rook will take on e1. You'll have queen to h3 with check. The queen will take, and then you'll have the bishop taking. And as you can see, you are down an entire exchange, and you are down a pawn, which is basically just completely lost. And for those of you out there that were thinking and that said, hey, you know, you don't have to, what's on my mouse here? My mouse is stuck. Come on. Come on. Off and on. Let's go. Let's go. What are we doing? Why are we stuck? Okay, so like my mouse, okay, there we go. Lord, my mouse was stuck. It didn't want to work. Okay, cool. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so for those of you that were thinking, hey, maybe if you don't accept it, you might be a little bit better. It's more of the same. So after, if you were to, let's say the knight was to take here, and then you went ahead and just took here instead of accepting it, you'd be taking the rook on e1. The rook would take back. You'd have bishop takes h3. And as you can see, you do have an extra piece for each side, but you have pretty much the same situation. You know, you have the knight coming to h4, you got the queen coming down. You just have really, really a lot of problems. The same as pretty much as you have in the original one. So going back to what we had, queen does take d4, bishop takes b3, we have pawn takes b3, and then we have d5. Magnus Carlsen actually misses the sacrifice as a second time. So he actually has the ability here to take knight takes h3. And then after pawn takes h3, you got knight to h4. And unfortunately, the computer is wanting you to put yourself into this fork, king to h2, because you have to prevent the taking of this pawn. There's just not any other way, because if you try to defend some kind of way, there really isn't anything you can do to defend, because once this queen takes this pawn, checkmate is coming on the next move, and you just don't have any way of, you know, getting rid of that. So the king wants to go to, you have to go to h2 with the king. After you get forked on f3, the king would come back to g2. After knight takes, bishop would take, and you're just down a truckload of material that you don't want to be down. So pawn takes b3. We do have d5, and then we have a queen coming down to d2. This is actually a position where Wesley so actually missed a nice chance, and that was actually, man, what is my mouse doing, bro? Come on. Need like another battery or something. This is really kind of annoying. Man, I'm like, okay. I'm in the middle of this video, and for some reason my mouse is just not working. Let's go. Thank you, Lord. Don't need any of that stuff. Okay, so anyway, I don't need to set up the device. I'm good. Thank you. Man, that is really kind of annoying. I apologize, everybody, for that. Okay. Okay. All right. So, the bishop would take on f4, and then after knight takes f4, pawn would take d5, knight would take d5, and then you have knight to g3. And as you can see, all of your issues are pretty much taken care of, you know, right now. So you don't have any sacrifice issues anymore. But like I said, the queen did come to d2. And this allows a sacrifice, which is fairly sound, but it's just not crushing like it was before. And that is knight takes h3. After pawn takes h3, you got queen takes h3, and then you have f4. So you do kind of have a little bit of ability to kind of, you know, defend a little bit here, a lot better than you did before. So the knight will come to h4. We see knight to h2, pawn takes e4. So as you can see, you are up a piece. But you are down a crap load of pawns. So you're down 3 entire pawns. So black definitely has compensation for the piece. And that's generally how it goes. You know, when you're in a situation where you've sacrificed a piece, usually when you can get at least 2 or 3 pawns for that, then you've pretty much established compensation for the sacrifice. Not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. So we see queen to f2. Rook comes to e8. We got queen to f1, trying to desperately trade off the queens. Queen comes to g3 with check. King goes to h1. We have knight to f5, and then we have queen to g2. And this is more or less forcing a trade because the queen really only has the ability to go here. And then you would see bishop to f2. And then you'd be attacking this pawn here. You'd have the ability to swing over. So there's just too many attacking chances for white. So we trade on g2. King takes g2. We have knight takes e3. Rook takes c3. We have f5. And I'm going to run through these moves kind of quick a little bit because I've lost a little bit of time with my mouse situation. And just basically because, you know, you kind of get into a pretty even game coming up here. So we see knight to f1. We got rook e to d8. Got rook e to e1. And so as you can see, this knight is holding the penetration square here for the rook. So the rook doesn't really have too many places to go. You also could have maybe put the rook on d3 and then swung this rook over just to give yourself a little bit of some options here. So the king comes to f7. We have rook e to d1, king to f6, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, rook takes a5. Still holding this penetration square, so the rook doesn't really have a lot of places to go. We have g5, pawn takes g5 with check, king takes g5. We have king to f2. We have h5. You know, past pawns must be pushed, especially since we're up all these pawns. You know, it's good to start getting these pawns rolling. We have knight to e3. After b5, blocking because, you know, we were going to be taken here with check. Knight comes to f1. We have h4. We got rook to a7. And so this is important because, you know, you always want to be putting your rook on the 7th rank. And so rook to h8. We got rook to f7. We have h3. Knight to g3. You have to make this move because you have to defend this square so that the pawn can't promote. You have h2. Rook takes f5 with check. We have king to g4. And then, of course, now we have to get the rook out of the way because we're going to be having to sacrifice our knight in the second. So the rook does come to h1. And this is this is kind of funny. You know, he just kind of gets down there to, you know, promote to a knight. So the knight, so you have h1 equals knight on h1 with check. The knight takes on h1. The rook takes on h1. Then you have rook takes c6. So it kind of looks like white is having the ability to win, you know, because they're up a pawn, but you do have king to f4. After rook to f6 with check, you see rook to e5. You see king to e5, and you see rook to f8. And this is something I want you guys to be paying attention to, too. Rook comes to f8. Now, The thing that you want to always do when you're in a rook endgame, or you're having maybe rook in a minor piece or something like that, and you have the king that is coming up to attack the rook, you want to maintain what is called a checking distance, and that is why you see rook to f8 and not rook to f7. Because if you moved rook to f7, the king could just come up here and attack the rook again, and then you're getting in this kind of a situation here where you're not really giving yourself enough distance, and so. Probably not in that particular situation, but just a general rule of thumb is when your rook is attacked by a king in an endgame like this, you do want to move as far away as possible with the rook so that you do have the checking distance. That is an idea. So we have rook to h2 with check, king comes to e3, we have rook takes b2, and then we have b4. And as you can see, black has pretty much equalized the game. So it's when you have a rook endgame. Rook endgames, a lot of times they can be drawn. They're not as drawn as bishops of opposite colors, but it's very hard to press through for a win for either side. So you see rook to h2. The rook comes to e8 with check. Rook to d5. We have rook to d8 with check. We have rook king to e5. We have rook to e8 with check. King to d5. Rook to d8 with check. We have king to e5. Rook to e8 with check. And we do have a draw by threefold repetition. So like I said, that is a pretty roller coaster game. Both sides had chances to just like completely win the game. And it was pretty curious. It was pretty curious that that Magnus Carlsen did miss all those sacrifices in a row. That's not something that you generally would see him missing, especially something that seemed like it just kind of was screaming to be played. But, there's no telling. I mean, the players might be tired. He might have been calculating something that wasn't really fully there, or maybe he just felt like it didn't work all the way. There's no telling. I'm not in Magnus Carlsen's head. But yeah, I apologize earlier, guys, for, my mouse messing up for some reason. I have it on, it's a wireless mouse. And so it wasn't, for whatever reason, I guess the connection was blocked. So it wasn't doing, it wasn't moving. So that's not really the best thing to have in the middle of a video. But appreciate you guys being patient. Mary Ming Salamat, Kaibagan, for coming through. Mabu Hai, and I'll say Pa Alam to you guys. See you guys later on. All right, appreciate it.